Hi, I'm Derrick Jensen. This is Resistance Radio on the Progressive Radio Network. My guest today is Rachael Paschal Osborn, a public interest water lawyer in Spokane, Washington. She serves as Senior Policy Advisor to the Center for Environmental Law and Policy, Policy Director for the Columbia Institute for Water Policy, and Adjunct Professor teaching water law at Gonzaga Law School. So first, thank you for your work, and second, thank you for being on the program.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
So, tell me about. Well, actually, I was going to ask. Tell me about the Columbia River, but I want to ask another question first, and that's, tell me about your work, and then we'll jump to the Columbia.
Okay. Well, I'm an attorney, and my job really is to represent rivers and aquifers with the goal of protecting them from diversions or degradation, and really focusing on trying to maintain sustainable quantity of water. So, and I do that through a variety of ways, through litigation, through legislative process. I do a lot of work advocating in Washington State with the agency that issues water rights, and in the public arena, because people understand that water is an essential element of life, and so education is always good.
And because do you primarily focus on the Columbia River Basin, or do you also do water rights and water policy on the Monongahela and the Ohio?
No, my geographic focus is Washington State, where I practice, and also a little bit in North Idaho, which is near Spokane.
So tell people about the Columbia. The people may have heard of the river, but they may not know much about it. What was it like? What is it like? Help them to fall in love with it.
Well, the Columbia River is really an amazing river. It's, I think, the fourth largest river in North America. And it flows from the east, sort of the eastern boundary of British Columbia, north of Washington State, down through the center of the eastern part of Washington, and then eventually into the Pacific, and forms the boundary between Washington and Oregon. And it's about 1,240 miles long, and it has, at one time it was a phenomenal resource in terms of the salmon populations that it supported. The estimates vary, but we've heard, there were at one time 16 million salmon returning to the Columbia River as adults every year, several different species. And salmon are an indicator species. There were a lot of other types of fish, aquatic creatures in the river too, but they're the ones that are sort of the iconic symbol of river health for this part of the world. It was a source of support for the many, many Native American tribes and First Nations in the region, and this area was very well populated because tribes could live on the salmon and support, fairly large populations of people. So, but it's a big river, and it also, within the watershed has many tributaries, ranging from the Snake River, which flows out of Idaho, the Yakima, the Willamette, which flows near Portland. It flows north into the Columbia, the Spokane, where I live, and the Okanagan. So there are there are major rivers that are actually tributaries to the Columbia itself. It's really a fantastic watershed, surrounded by mountains. To the west, the Cascade Range. To the east, the Northern Rockies. And at its headwaters, which are some wetlands that are actually remain protected under the Ramsar Convention, at the very headwaters of the Columbia River, there's it's the Jasper area of the Northern Rockies. Banff is up there. It's kind of well known area for visiting, and the Columbia ice fields, a glacier system of glaciers that are basically form the headwaters and the first runoff that feeds into the Columbia River.
And you mentioned other species. Do lampreys go up the Columbia? Because I know that I live in far northern California, and as well as salmon, we have lampreys here.
Mm-hmm. Right. Lampreys did and do inhabit the Columbia River and are actually becoming a species, it's sort of a focal species for restoration. The tribes love lampreys. They're an important, they call them a first food, and they'd like to see their restoration. So, the sad thing about the Columbia, of course, is that it is the drop from its headwaters to the Pacific Ocean it's a pretty steep drop as rivers go, and making it ideal for damming to develop hydroelectric power. And so there are now 14 very large dams on just the main stem of the Columbia River, not even looking at what's in the tributaries in between British Columbia and the United States. And those dams have radically altered the flow of the river, the timing of the flow, and the water quality of the river. And have also, Chief Joseph and Grand Coulee Dam, of course, have blocked salmon migration completely into the upper Columbia River.
And so I guess before we go on, also, what are some of the cascading effects of, well, first off, you said there were 16 million salmon before, and what would be a current estimate of salmon? Obviously, to the upper reaches is zero at this point, right?
Correct.
And so what would be some of the cascading environmental effects of an absence of salmon to both humans and non-humans?
Well, salmon were a source of food, but much beyond that, cultural and economic resource to the First Nations in Canada and the tribes, the Native American tribes in the upper part of the river in the United States. So the extirpation of salmon out of the system has caused great hardship and impoverished these people who were fish eaters and who relied heavily on salmon as a major source of protein. In fact, Dr. Alan Schultz at Eastern Washington University has done some very interesting research analyzing, based on the accounts of settlers who came into the region from the eastern United States and Europe, about the amount of fish that the tribes were taking out of the river and harvesting, preparing, and storing as food for the annual needs. And it's phenomenal. Hundreds of pounds per person were being harvested out of the river, including here in Spokane, right here at the Spokane Falls where I live. Big Chinook salmon were coming up the river along with steelhead. So it's had a devastating effect on the native peoples who depended on it. But salmon were also a part of the ecosystem, and it's been documented that they would be the carcasses of salmon both in the river and taken out of the river by people and also by animals, such as, for example, bears. The carcasses that would be taken out would actually be a source of nutrient for plant growth in riparian areas adjacent to rivers, and so there was a cycle there of the nutrient deposition that helped keep riparian areas healthy, which in turn helped keep the riparian or the river itself healthy for the salmon.
I'm making up the number, but I remember reading somewhere that trees in salmon-dependent forests grow something like, I'm making up the number, but it's not out of the realm of possibility, like 70% faster than trees that have had the salmon taken from the streams. It's just extraordinary how much they help everybody.
Right. Well, I mean, if anybody that uses Alaska fish fertilizer on their garden knows salmon make great fertilizer. Fish make good fertilizer, and so of course it would be a tremendous benefit for the trees and any kind of vegetation that was within that riparian zone, and that would where salmon carcasses were decomposing.
Well, and another thing that just kills me about all this is people complain when bears go to garbage dumps, and it's like, what do you expect them to do when you've taken away their main source of food? When just the salmon just make an incredible. Once again, I'm making up the number, but I think I saw a study where, once again, I want everybody to be clear, I'm making the number up. It's like 200 different species of animals eat salmon, or 120 or something, some huge number. Everybody from ravens and eagles to flies to bears to humans to everybody eats them. And baby salmon, actually, baby salmon also eat the carcasses of the old salmon from last year.
And then baby salmon themselves are eaten quite a bit. So that's been one of the issues with restoration, is that a salmon to the system is that it supports the development of populations that concentrate in areas, human-made areas, like the big sandbar at the mouth of the Columbia, and the gates, the fish passage gates at Bonneville Dam, where we have the sea lions concentrating, or this massive colony of cormorants on this man-made dredged sandbar that are feeding on baby salmon as they exit the river on their way out to the ocean.
Sometimes, I'm going to go a slightly different direction for a second. Sometimes we hear that humans are inherently destructive and that we just can't help ourselves because we're so darn smart that we're going to destroy everything, which actually destroying everything does not seem particularly smart to me. But how long, at the very least, okay, I'll back up a second. Where I live, the Tolowa lived here, if you believe science, the Tolowa lived here for 12,500 years. They've carbon dated it back to that time. And if you believe the Tolowa, they lived here since the beginning of time. And how long, according to both the tribes and the First Nations people, and also according to science, how long have humans lived along the Columbia?
Well, I think the tribes would tell you they've been here since time immemorial, which is one way of measuring it, which is since memory. But if you want to get more technical, this part of the world had glaciation up until about 12 to 15,000 years ago, and was really not habitable. As the glaciers receded after that last ice age, the lands became immediately inhabited by salmon and by people. So, and they've recently, I don't know if you've heard of Kennewick Man. It was a set of bones that was uncovered in some landslide adjacent to the Columbia River, probably caused by fluctuating reservoir levels. But these bones are very old, dating back 10,000 years, and there's been a battle they were found maybe 10, 12 years ago over ownership of the bones, but recently it's finally been decided that, just as the Yakima Nation said, this Kennewick Man was a Native American and probably related to the tribes.
So that was a lead-up question to the next question, which is how are some of the ways that the humans who lived there, I mean, obviously, if there are 16 million salmon coming in when the first Europeans arrived, then they didn't destroy the place, just like the Tolowa didn't destroy this place. So how did they live in place without harming the salmon? Is it simply because they had a spiritual relationship with the salmon? Is it also because of policy agreements between different nations, different Indian nations? How did it all work?
Well, I think there probably was a spiritual or a cultural approach that was very different than the Eurocentric approach that the migrants coming in brought with them. So that would be part of it. And there was certainly a lower level of technology and although there was a good deal of trade that was going on among and between tribes in different regional areas throughout the Pacific Northwest, there was an overwhelming abundance of salmon. And the first major threat to salmon that occurred actually was not the dams, but when settlers came in and set up fish wheels and built canneries and began harvesting salmon at just alarming rates in order to can them and ship them elsewhere in the world. So, and salmon apparently was a major source of protein in the United States during the Major Depression because of the canneries here in along the Columbia.
So tell me,
as well as I'm sure in California.
So, tell me about some of the threats to the Columbia right now, and also some of its tributaries.
Well, the major threat to the Columbia at this point are the dams for a couple of reasons. One is because they alter the hydrographs so that water is stored in these massive reservoirs during the spring runoff for release at a later time when more convenient or when electrical demand is higher. So there's that impact on the flow of the river, and for salmon it's an issue because in the spring freshet, that natural freshet, the huge flow that used to occur during the snowmelt period was what pushed baby salmon down the river and out to the Pacific Ocean. And because the juvenile salmon now have to contend with these slackwater pools behind, a dozen reservoirs, up to a dozen reservoirs, then their journey is slowed. They're more subject to predation. They're not actually swimming out. They're going with the current. In fact, I've heard baby salmon go down the river tail first. So that's one problem. But another problem is that we put a lot of toxic chemicals. We live as a chemically dependent society, and so a lot of that goes into the rivers and accumulates in sediments behind the dams and along the rivers, and so water quality is degraded. And throughout the Columbia now we have advisories to people to not eat fish or to limit their intake of fish because of the problem of bioaccumulating toxics such as PCBs that are dangerous, particularly to women who are pregnant or to small children. There are a variety of chemicals. There are just about anything you can imagine is out there. There are temperature issues and dissolved gas issues with the spill of water below dams and so forth. So it's very discouraging. And especially, we recently, the fish consumption advisory was just announced, I think last year, for the lower part of the Columbia. So this is not old stuff. This is new stuff that's happening.
So I just want to be clear. In our brilliance, we in this culture have converted the Columbia from a place where people might eat, I think you said 100 pounds per year of fish or more, to much more, to a place where you have to be warned not to eat the fish because they're so toxic. Does this seem like a good idea to you?
Well, of course not. It's a terrible, series of events that have occurred to lead to this point where we're being warned off of and away from the fish.
And another thing, you mentioned the slack water, something I don't think people know. You can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I seem to remember reading that because salmon, obviously it's very different to be a freshwater fish than a saltwater fish, and the fish who are especially in the upper reaches, have only a certain amount of time that they can live in fresh water before they start to convert. And so one of the problems is if they're not making it, is this accurate that if they don't make it to the ocean in time, they get in real trouble that way too?
Well, it can be, although my understanding of the biology is that there is a conversion that occurs as they become exposed to salt water.
Oh, okay. I seem to remember.
Estuary itself, well, and it depends on the species that you're talking about, but the estuary system is very important because of the, the decreased salinity at the top and the ability, so water becoming more saline as you get to the ocean. And some species will actually hold in that estuary system.
Okay.
There, some kind of biochemical process goes on.
This is one of the things that kills me about all this work that both you and I have been doing for a long, long time is that I can't imagine. I mean, I love the line by David Ehrenfeld that nature's not only more complex than we think, it's more complex than we can think. Just there's all this incredible complexity that goes into a natural community, and the notion that you can just run in, drop a bunch of concrete across a river and not expect for things to be damaged. I mean, for relationships to be destroyed, it boggles my mind.
Indeed. And right, we tend to destroy that complexity with our Western ways.
Yeah. Is it even possible for us to really talk about the Columbia for 45 or 48 minutes without talking about Hanford as a threat to the river?
Right. Hanford is one, and the agricultural diversions and development is another major issue. But Hanford, of course, is one of the most polluted sites on the planet. It's the site where the U.S. Was converting raw materials, uranium and so forth, into fuel for bombs, the atomic bomb, before and during World War II. And they were extraordinarily careless in the way that those materials were used and stored and eventually discarded. And so they created an area. It's a very arid, desert-like area adjacent to the Columbia River and along the only free-flowing stretch of the river in the United States called the Hanford Reach, which has now been turned into a national monument that is heavily polluted with radioactive materials. The groundwater is seeping into the river. And there is a species of spring chinook that migrates into the Columbia and spawns in the Hanford Reach because it's still got the gravels and the ecosystem requirements for in-river the spawning and rearing. And they say that there is a radioactive marker in the DNA of those fish because of what's leaking out from the Hanford site itself.
In a second, I want to ask you about the potential for putting in new dams on the tributaries of the Columbia. But first, I want to mention another fish, too, because we talk about salmon a fair amount, and I talk about salmon a fair amount. But another fish who is deeply harmed by dams in general is a sturgeon. Can you talk about the sturgeon on the Columbia system at all?
Right. Well, sturgeon they remain within the Columbia River, and they are they grow to be very large fish, many, many feet in length, and hundreds of pounds that basically they're living on the bottom of the river and now at the bottom of the reservoirs within the river. And, of course, they were a very important food for the native peoples in the area. The sturgeon, they're very, what is the word I want? They're like looking at dinosaurs or something. They're very striking looking fish. And they are now in decline. They will live to be 100 years old or more, and they get very large. They just keep growing over the years. But they are cut off from each other because of the reservoirs. They cannot pass through a dam system at all. They can't, even dams that have fish ladders on them, the sturgeon can't use. And so they're isolated within each reservoir, and this has become an issue of the, in terms of the reproductive success of the species, and the lack of diversity, genetic diversity, is needed to maintain a healthy population.
Actually, there's one more direction I want to go before I ask you about the dam. I mean, about possible new dams, and that's. I just think can you talk for just a second about the Missoula flood? Because I think the whole Missoula flood thing is so extraordinary. And I didn't even know about it until I was maybe 30. It's a massive thing. Can you talk about that for a second?
Sure. Well, as a part of the glaciation in the sort of glaciers and lobes of the glaciers were reaching down out of Canada into the northern parts of the United States, and that included into the headwaters of tributary to the Columbia River, coming out of Montana, and the Clark Fork system, which drains into Lake Pend Oreille, and which then drains into the Pend Oreille River, which eventually discharges into the Columbia. And at the point where the Clark Fork River meets the lake, there was an ice dam that would be created, and that would back up a lake, which was known as Glacial Lake Missoula, which was pretty much inundated all of western Montana. It was a massive lake system that included the Flathead Valley and the Bitterroot Valley and so forth. It was enormous. And for, I don't know how many times, as you say, making up a number, I'm going to suggest hundreds of times, the ice dam would break. And this might be because of rising temperatures, or the lake would essentially kind of carve under the ice dam and eventually float it. And this would cause the dam to break, and for all of the water in western Montana to rush out, and it would flow south through what is Spokane and then out onto the Columbia Plateau, gouging and creating what are known as coulees. This Grand Coulee Dam is named after an enormous coulee out on the plateau, carving the Columbia Gorge and eventually exiting to the Pacific Ocean. And this occurred again and again and again over the course of several tens of thousands of years. And it basically carved out the landscape that is now eastern Washington, including really beautiful basalt formations, what we call scablands, potholes. We're a very arid area. So it's kind of hard to imagine this massive the wall of water that must have come out with all of the rock and soil in it that dropped out along the way. We see these things called erratics, which are giant boulders. They might have arrived with the glaciers, but they also might have arrived with the glacial flooding that occurred with Glacial Lake Missoula. There's now an entity called the Ice Age Institute, which studies and promotes understanding, because this landscape goes for hundreds of miles from western Montana across North Idaho, eastern Washington, down through the Columbia Gorge, to kind of promote public understanding of the geology of it, of what we're seeing, and proposals to create some kind of national monument associated with it.
It kills me that the Columbia River, was able to survive these huge floods, but this culture is basically doing something that all the Missoula floods didn't. That really destroying the river. Because those floods were absolutely immense. Okay, so are the days of they've already dammed the Columbia and its tributaries, and we by now recognize how destructive large dams are. So there are no more large dams planned for any part of the Columbia River Basin, right?
That is correct.
Oh, I thought that was incorrect. Actually, I was trying to set you up. Isn't there? What about the one on the Yakima? Don't they want to build a big dam on the Yakima?
Well, with dam proposals these days, and there are certainly lots of proposals still out there. The problem is there are no good sites to put a dam anymore. So the one that you're talking about, which is known as the Black Rock Dam proposal, it's such a bad place. It would be so expensive to build, and it would be so risky because it would be perched above the Hanford Reservation, which we were just talking about, the radioactive former site of plutonium manufacture, that if it should break, and it would potentially, because there's an active earthquake fault under the location where they proposed to put the dam, it just becomes preposterous. That's a dam that will never be built. It is true, however, that these bad ideas never go away. And so the studies get trotted out. Someone spends a lot of money. They spent $18 million studying Black Rock Dam the last time around, and then the studies go on the shelf and they collect dust for another generation while everyone forgets, and then they'll be trotted out again. But in reality, there have been a number of proposals in the last few years, and they are all one by one going by the wayside because all of the good dam sites are gone. And not that you don't have to be an advocate to fight them when they get proposed. The most recent one was a proposal to put a dam on the Similkameen River in British Columbia called the Fortis Dam. And they just dropped that idea just a few months ago. So I'm happy to say that I just don't think any new dams will be built. And in fact, what we are seeing is we're entering into an era when dams are now being removed because their useful life has expired. And so we've seen several sizable dams coming out, and I expect to see more coming out in the future.
So what are the possibilities for that, potentialities for that along the Columbia? Can you talk about a couple of the success stories, or at least one success story for removal dams along the Columbia, and then also what other dams might be on the block?
The one big success story was the Condit Dam, which was on the White Salmon River, which is a tributary to the Columbia down in the Columbia Gorge, so just east of Portland by an hour or so. And the Condit Dam was up, you go up the White Salmon River. The White Salmon, there's a name, the reason for the name of that river, and the dam was blocking, of course, fish passage up into the upper watershed. That one was owned by, was it Pacificor, I think? And like all privately owned dams in the U.S., it had to have a license from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And licenses are issued for 30 to 50 years, and eventually theirs came up for renewal. And when it did, the FERC, or abetted by the federal fish and wildlife agencies like NOAA, was told that they would have to put fish passage on the dam, which made it completely infeasible to operate the dam. These old concrete plugs in the river are not in any way engineered for fish ladders or whatever. And so eventually, perhaps kicking and screaming a bit, Pacificor, the owner, came to the realization that what they had to do was decommission and take the dam out. And they did that. It came out, I think it was 2 years ago. It was interesting. Some dams, when they get removed, they go in and sort of take them down inch by inch or foot by foot. But with Condit, they just blew a hole in it, and they exploded the dam, and there it went. And they had made a decision that they didn't have to take the sediment out from behind it, that it was close enough to the Columbia to allow that sediment to just flow down the river and let the Columbia River take care of it. And within a few months of doing that, steelhead were spotted up above the dam. So,
and how is it doing now?
Better all the time. The rivers work to restore themselves when they're given the opportunity. When you take out the obstructions, they will move the sediment. They will create the riparian zones. They will become hospitable for the fish, and that's exactly what's happening. So we see that with Condit. We see it with the the two big dams that got removed off of the Elwha River on the Olympic Peninsula. As soon as that habitat opportunity occurs, the fish come back. And I really think it's built into the fish to do this, because the fish were populating themselves in the rivers of the Northwest just, during the ice ages. Anytime there was an opportunity, there was a melt off, or some of the glaciation had receded, fish would come in and habitat that river. That's what salmon do. If you give them the opportunity, they'll show up.
Yeah, they seem like that's one of the things that breaks my heart about salmon being in trouble, is that they don't seem a particularly fragile species. They seem like incredibly, I don't mean this in a pejorative way at all, but they seem kind of like rats. They seem very inquisitive and eager to explore and pretty resilient.
I think that's right, and they're built to last. And salmon spawning, you have, I don't know, 100 times, 1,000 times more eggs and baby salmon are hatched than will return to an area. I mean, if there were 16 million coming back into the Columbia River system, then there were hundreds of millions of baby fish going out, and that's how they reproduce. They really are built for it.
So are there realistic possibilities of some more dams coming out on the Columbia River Basin in the foreseeable future?
Yeah, there's one that's actually lined up to go. That's the Mill Pond Dam, which is adjacent to Sullivan Lake, which is north in the Pend Oreille County area. There's one that's been taken out near Missoula, the Milltown Dam, that's been coming out. That one was rather complex because there were quite a lot of toxic sediments behind that dam, and so they had to actually dredge those out of the river, which meant they had to move the river in order to get to the sediments. And then one that we've been working on that I'm pretty confident is going to be coming out is Inlow Dam, which is on the Similkameen, which is a tributary coming out of British Columbia that flows into the Okanagan River, and the Okanagan then flows into the Columbia just below Chief Joseph Dam.
And what sort of other good things are happening in the region?
There are a lot of habitat restoration projects that are going on, and I think what's near and dear to my heart is our proposals to where I work on water quantity issues, and we have massively and historically dewatered our rivers by diverting water out of them for agricultural use primarily, and as well as other industrial or municipal uses. And we just don't have enough water flowing in our rivers. And so one of the restoration trends that we've been seeing is to go back in and obtain these water rights that certify or authorize the removal of water from river. And usually it's a matter of going in and purchasing them because they're considered to be a property right, and return that water to the river. So eliminating that the whatever the out of stream use was, and removing the diversion so that there's more water flowing in the river. It's really important. A lot of money has been made available to do these kinds of transactions, purchasing water rights and returning them, and it can really make a big difference in tributaries and even in the sub-tributaries of the rivers, which are places that are important habitat for salmon and other species, but if you dry them up, the fish can't get there.
So I remember I was interviewing somebody about the Colorado River, and he said something that astounded me, which was that water rights have been sold for more than 100% of the water in the river. And we've got like 7 or 8 minutes left. Can you do a 4-minute intro to people on how water rights work in the West, and then also can you confirm that that this actually happens, that they allocate more than 100% of the water in a river? That seems completely nuts to me.
Yeah, the Western water law, which is known as prior appropriation doctrine, and which is better known as first in time is first in right, actually originated out of the mining camps in California, gold mining camps in the mid-1800s, in which an older, more sustainable system of water law was, if you had access to the water that flowed through your property, but there wasn't necessarily water flowing where the gold was. So they created this system which says you can take water out of a river and you can move it out of the watershed anywhere you want it if you're the first one to access it.
So basically it's the playground rule of finders, keepers, losers, weepers.
Yeah, very similar to that. So this developed as throughout the western states because most of the states are arid and water isn't necessarily where you need it. And starting in the mid to late 1800s, there was, in my view, it was settlers were moving in, they were claiming their land, and they were taking the water, and none of this was authorized. It was basically stealing out of the system, and then the law followed along after to justify what had been done. There's no question that between the claims that were made before the laws were created and then the permits that were issued after we adopted water codes, in many places far exceed the amount of water that is in the river. And the thinking is that, well, whoever is junior will just have to curtail if it's a bad year and water's not available for everybody. The system is a self-correcting system. But there are many, many problems. Obviously, this is extremely inequitable. More importantly, the first water users in the West were the native peoples who lived here. And in fact, they had the rights and owned all resources at the time that settlers began moving in, and that's why the treaties were created. They continue to have water rights to rivers that predate. In fact, sometimes in-stream flow rights for tribes to support treaty fisheries are, again, referred to as time immemorial rights. The whole system is really dependent on the idea that if you don't use your water right, then you'll lose it, and yet the law isn't very good in recognizing that, and people tend to hoard water and to hoard their rights. It's also a system that really requires people to be efficient with their water rights, but we do a terrible job with that too. So there are many different problems with how this Western water law system works.
That's playing out right now in California, too. I just read an article yesterday about how even with the drought and even with all sorts of other things happening in California, including the extirpation of the Delta smelt, for example, the dewatering of rivers, that the farmers who had the first rights, there's now actually some big fights going on between different farmers because the farmers with the first rights are doing exactly what you say and hoarding.
That's right. I was just reading about that myself, and that there's some sense by the state that maybe it needs to go in and look at who's using what of the water of the agricultural users around the Sacramento Delta.
It seems to me that the way to use water rights would be the same as with everything else. That the only thing that makes sense to me is that because the land supports all life, that the land has to be that the health of the land has to be the primary determinant of who gets what water.
Yeah, I would agree. So that we really ought to be thinking of rivers first, and what rivers need. We need to be thinking about sustainability. We need to be thinking about intergenerational impacts. When we draw down our groundwater to the point where we're mining it, that means we're not leaving anything for the future. So it's really, we should be viewing this in a whole different way. But water is so valuable and so intrinsic to economic growth that most people are looking to see how much they can get out of the system.
So we have like a couple minutes left, and I have a couple questions. But first, before that, I would love to have you on again. We don't talk about the Columbia, but we instead spend the whole time talking about Western water rights, what's wrong with it. Basically, expand the last 4 minutes into 45, because I think that's a hugely important topic for everywhere. Do you want to do that sometime?
Sure, I'd love to.
Okay. So my questions now are, one of them, I guess I have three questions. First is, how did you get started? Why do you do the work you do?
I was introduced to concepts about water allocation and the need to protect the public interest in water through the Mono Lake case out of California, which is the public trust doctrine case. And I was fortunate to have a really great teacher in law school who set me on my path.
Well, when we talk about water rights, let's talk about public trust too, because I know that's really important to your work. The next question is, if people are in the Columbia River Basin and they would like to help the Columbia, what should they do? How can they help the Columbia?
Well, one thing that they could do is get involved with the Columbia Futures Project, which is run by John Osborn, John at waterplanet.ws. And there are a lot of different, the Columbia is a big place. There are a lot of different problems throughout the basin, but we're working on various, issues in several of the tributaries as well as the main stem. One thing we haven't even touched on today is the Columbia River Treaty between the United States and Canada that is essentially up for renegotiation right now, and the efforts to change the focus of the treaty from just hydropower and flood control to ecosystem restoration as well. So there are a lot of opportunities to work on projects that are advocating for the river.
If somebody is interested in doing something but they don't know what's going on in their area, can they contact you to have you put them in touch with somebody local? Like if they live in Yakima or in Penticton or whatever?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Okay. And can you tell people how to do that?
Probably the best way would be to contact me through my blog, which is naiads at naiads.wordpress.com.
Okay, and my last question is, if you were made queen of all things Columbia River, and the rule is you can't get rid of capitalism and you can't destroy this entire culture for now. You can do that in a month or something. But for now, what would you do on the Columbia if they with the current system intact? What would you do if you could do whatever you wanted? You had essentially infinite money. What would you do on the Columbia to help it right now?
Well, I would change the way the hydropower system is operated so that we return to a more natural flow system where we have the spring flows. We stop looking at floods as the enemy and instead think about flooding as a good thing, particularly in the lower estuaries, allowing inundation, getting people out of the floodplain, and restoring that habitat for the baby salmon as they're on their way out, and the migrating adults as they're on their way back.
Well, that's great. And I would like to thank you again for your work, and thank you for being on the program. And I would like to thank listeners for listening. My guest today has been Rachael Osborn. This is Derrick Jensen for Resistance Radio on the Progressive Radio Network.